Discordianism is founded on the notion of the trickster, first proposed by renowned psychologist Carl Jung, to explain the recurring archetype of the devil and its variations. It represents the attempt to revive what has been interpreted to be the dying god cults of ancient times, but often coloured by modern interpretation. In other words, the same tradition of the wise fool that eventually inspired the mystic crew of commerce. The first to recognise the recurring archetype of the dying and rising god was James Frazer in The Golden Bough, first published in 1890, which has had a substantial influence on European anthropology and thought. Frazer's thesis of the dying god and the sacred king had an immense influence on a large number of authors inspired by the occult, such as Robert Graves, William Butler Yeats, H.P. Lovecraft, Sigmund Freud, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, D.H. Lawrence, Aleister Crowley, Ezra Pound, and Julius Evola. T.S. Eliot acknowledged indebtedness to Frazer in his first note to his poem The Waste Land. And influential was Margaret Murray, the principal theorist of witchcraft as a, quote, pagan survival in the witch cult in Europe. Although modern pagans would deny it, claiming the worship, their, quote, horned god, was ignorantly disparaged by the bigotry of the church. The dying god was universally viewed as a god of evil. Borrowing from Frazer's thesis of the dying god, the, quote, horned god of modern pagans is the lord of the underworld, the sun, while the goddess is the moon. In the Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious by Jung, Jung lists the Feast of Fools as a European adaptation of the trickster archetype. Similarly, Wiccan priestess Margaret Adler in Drawing Down the Moon, which provided the first comprehensive look at modern pagan religions in the US, begins her chapter on Discordianism by mentioning the work of Harvey Cox, who in Feast of Fools, quotes, develops a theory of play, asserting, like others before him, that our society has lost or mutilated the gift of true festivity, playful fantasy, and celebration. End quote. Adler was the granddaughter of Alfred Adler, who collaborated with Freud and found the Adler Society. She also cites the classic study on play written in 1944 by Johann Huizinga, who wrote that play and ritual was interrelated, and that all sacred rites are performed in the spirit of play. Nothing that, quote, the outlaw, the revolutionary, the Kabbalist, or member of a secret society, indeed heretics of all kinds, are of a highly associative, if not sociable disposition, and a certain element of play is prominent in all their doings. End quote. However, according to David Carleon, the romantic notion of the daring political jester, which has been popularised over the last few decades, especially since the protests of the 1960s, Carleon concludes that, quote, popular culture embraces a sentimental image of the clown. Writers reproduce that sentimentality in the jester, and academics in the trickster, though it, quote, falters as analysis, end quote. As Carleon points out, the trickster cliché is an adaptation of Shakespeare's concept of the jester, and examples of truth-telling fools in The Twelfth Night, As You Like It, and King Lear. Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe, written in 1819, and Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, written in 1889, are two literary examples of the enduring fashion. As Carleon notes, quote, the jester, comic sidekick in that era's medieval mania, was imagined saying to the king that no one else dared say. End quote. According to Carleon, Soviet philosopher Bakhtin's theory of the carnivalesque, to playfully invert social conventions through humour and chaos is another obvious influence. The idea of the carnivalesque originated in Bakhtin's Problem of Dostoevsky's Poets, written in 1929, further developed in Rabelais and His World, written in 1940. Bakhtin traces the origins of the carnivalesque to the concept of carnival, itself related to the Feast of Fools. It was one of the leading situationists, Raoul Vaneigem, in his book The Revolution of Everyday Life, written in 1967, who inspired the May 1968 student movement with what could be called carnival liberation theory. Vaneigem observed that, quote, a strike for higher wages or a rowdy demonstration can awaken the carnival spirit, end quote, and, quote, revolutionary movements are carnivals in which the individual life celebrates its unification with a regenerated society, end quote. Archetypes, according to Jung, are fundamentally human themes found throughout world mythology, and are the product of what he calls the collective unconscious. Included motifs are the mother, the child, the trickster, and the flood, among others. Reinvented from culture to culture in mythology and folklore, the trickster is presented as God, spirit, man, woman, anthropomorphic animal, supernatural being, or the occasional mischievous fairy who disobey rules and conventional behaviour, causing chaos while also inspiring some kind of change to occur. The trickster is a shapeshifter, and so has the possibility of transformation. The fool, or the court jester, survives in modern playing cards as the Joker. As suggested by J.P. Hansen in the book called The Trickster and the Paranormal, the term trickster was probably first used in this context by Daniel G. Brinton in 1885. Brinton, an American archaeologist and ethnologist, graduated from Yale in 1858, where he had been a member of the Scroll and Key secret society. In mythology, and in the study of folklore and religion, a trickster is a character in a story, god, goddess, spirit, man, woman, or anthropomorphization, which exhibits a great degree of intellect or secret knowledge, and uses it to play tricks or otherwise disobey normal rules and conventional behaviour. Tricksters are archetypal characters who appear in the myths of many different cultures. Lewis Hyde describes the trickster as a, quote, boundary crosser. The trickster crosses both physical boundaries and often breaks societal rules. Tricksters, quote, violate principles of social and natural order, playfully disrupting normal life and then re-establishing it on a new basis, end quote. According to Lewis Hyde in the book The Trickster Makes This World, he writes, I want to argue a paradox that the myth asserts, that the origins, liveliness and durability of cultures requires that there be a space for figures whose function is to uncover and disrupt the very things that cultures are based on, end quote. Thus the trickster archetype is an important model for modern occultism, particularly through chaos magic and Discordianism, which is dedicated to the worship of Eris, the goddess of chaos and a trickster. Their pranksterism, according to Ian Bear, writing in the neo-pagan journal Green Egg, is referred to as divine irreverence. Quote, the trickster is able to bring up in a humorous way issues that may still be too controversial to begin serious debates over. Willingness to parody ourselves protects us from becoming truly ridiculous, and renders parodies of us by our enemies utterly useless. If the New Agers were more willing to parody themselves, their culture might have filtered out some of its more absurd notions, and spared itself much vicious lampooning from without. It is the job of the Discordian to disrupt unhealthy patterns, including one's own. It should be noted that making pointless wisecracks just as the energy is peaking in a ritual is not a positive use of irreverence. On a larger scale, the chaos magician is able to work vast changes unattainable through ordinary, orderly means. But from all its tomfoolery, Discordianism also has a dangerous side. Aside from its connection to the JFK assassination, it betrays disturbing associations with Satanism and Nazism, and with libertarianism through its association with the Freedom School of former I Am member Robert Lefevre, which had numerous ties to the John Birch Society. Discordianism's founder, Kerry Thornley, was raised Mormon, but in adulthood he shifted his ideology frequently, and after being a Marxist, fondly read a copy of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged and converted to objectivism. For her doctrine of radical selfishness and individualism, Ayn Rand is one of the principal authors cited in the Satanic Bible of Anton LaVey, who explains that his religion is just, quote, Ayn Rand's philosophy with ceremony and ritual added, end quote. Joseph Marone, in, quote, the book The Trickster Icon and Objectivism, suggests that Rand served as a trickster archetype. Rand sought to challenge 2,000 years of Christianity. Her goal was partly to counter altruism, and she held as virtues that which the Church called vices. E. Merrill points out in the book Ayn Rand Explained From Tyranny to Tea Party that a desire to épater le bourgeois is at work, in which, quote, Rand takes an almost childish delight in defying the conventions and shocking the reader, end quote. Merrill roots Rand's, quote, predilection for paradox and her pleasure in surprising and shocking the reader in the influence of O. Henry and Oscar Wilde. On Rand's use of paradox, Stefan Cox observed that she loved the artist's ability to make life look interesting by changing the point of view from which it is seen. She loved antithesis, irony, paradox, parody, reversal. She loved the freedom that a spiritual outsider has to explore what happens when normal perspectives are inverted.